Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we are beginning a study today of the letter of John to Gaius, which we know as 3rd John, and it's part of our larger study of neglected books of the New Testament. We spent a few days talking about 2nd John. In fact, we introduced 2nd and 3rd John together. We said some things that I think I need to remind us all of. The first is that these are very personal letters. They're not necessarily to congregations, although they include messages to the congregation. 2nd John, likely to the congregation and the lady that was hosting that congregation. But 3rd John, is to a guy named Gaius. And they're very much like the letter to Philemon. We've talked about that. Now, they're very personal. They're about one issue. They're by someone who describes himself as old, someone who says, you better get your house in order because I'm coming to visit, and someone who really needs things to get better, even though he's some distance away and is not there to make sure that they are. We also said that 2nd and 3rd John are both about really the same topic, and the same topic is hospitality. In 2nd John, hospitality is being extended to false teachers, and John needs that to stop. In 3rd John, hospitality is not being extended to faithful brethren who need it. And when we talked a bit about hospitality during our study of 2nd John, I do want to remind you that we're not just talking about, easy fellowship. Some people would say, a napkin and fork stuff, but it certainly includes that. But it would also include much more. I compared it to the Blue Book that African Americans used to have to use at the mid part of the 20th century if they were traveling in the South, to know what accommodations were available to them and which ones were not. Christian hospitality was necessary for the furtherance of the gospel. And it also often meant that you were putting yourself at risk of being in trouble with the authorities and your family at risk when you extended it. Nowadays, when I think of first century hospitality in the 21st century, I think about the way the Saturn Road congregation really surrounded Paul and Denise Linton, our members here, when they had that terrible accident down in Dallas, Texas, or the way James and Amina were taken in by the churches in Atlanta when she went in for that very invasive surgery that she ultimately did not recover from, or the way Togba John and his family moved here from Liberia and were put up by families here, most notably the Goodmans, and how the Sebring Church then received them when they moved to Florida and took them in until they got on their feet. That's what we're talking about. That was necessary in the first century for the furtherance of the gospel. Unlike 2nd John, 3rd John is written to a specific person, a guy named Gaius. Gaius is a very common name, and there is at least one, and I think 2 other Gaiuses in the New Testament that we've met already. We meet a Gaius in Acts chapters 19 and 20, who is an associate of the Apostle Paul. He's a guy from Derbe, and from the twin cities of Lystra and Derbe, from Derbe. And he's mentioned in connection as well in Acts chapter 20, verse 4, with Timothy, who's also from the Twin Cities. If you'll remember, when Paul was there at Lystra and Derbe, he was stoned and left for dead outside the city walls, and then got up and went back in. We're also told in Acts chapter 19 that he's with Paul in Ephesus when the great riot takes place, and they fill the amphitheater, which is still there, and yell for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," and they haul certain Christians in, because they're so angry at Christians, and one of those Christians they haul in to the amphitheater is Gaius. We're also told in Romans chapter 16, verse 23, that there is a Gaius who is hosting Paul and hosting the church where Paul is when he writes their letter to the Romans, which could be Corinth, could be Ephesus, or some other place, but he's Paul's co-worker. There's also another co-worker of Paul, or at least associate of Paul, mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1:14. But this Gaius is a Corinthian, and Paul says that he is, and he says, when I was there, I didn't really baptize any of you guys except Gaius. I can't believe that that's the same Gaius we meet in Acts 19 and 20, though it may be the same Gaius that we talked about in Romans 16. I think those are two different Gaiuses. It's a common name. And it might be hard to think that either of those two guys, whom Paul would have known in the 30s and 40s, was still alive and would be the recipient of this letter in the 90s, 60 years later, at least, maybe 70 years later. So this may be a different Gaius altogether. Same topic, but different issues. The topic is hospitality, but the issue in 2 John is false teaching, and John is very stern, and he uses the word Antichrist to describe the false teachers, and we won't rehash that. We talked about that at length. The issue in 3 John is the issue which I've said in introductory pieces to these two letters already, has caused equally as much problem as false teaching has, and maybe as much as false teaching and persecution have together. The issue in 3 John is male egos. John names names in this letter in the way he didn't in the other letter. We learn about not only Gaius, who receives the letter, but Demetrius and Diotrephes. Demetrius probably carrying the letter, John's associate, which was probably not well received, and then Diotrephes, who does not receive John's people. And the reason he doesn't receive them is because he loves the preeminence. He wants to be the big shot. This isn't about doctrine. It's not about theology. And it's not about persecution. This is about male ego. He wants to be the big shot. And not only does he refuse to extend hospitality to John's associates, but he refuses to let anybody else in that church do it. So he has them under his thumb, and he doesn't want John to horn in on the thing that he has. He has puffed himself up. And that's the issue. The issue is male egos. And he's equally as stern in this letter as he is in 2 John. But he doesn't call this guy Antichrist, because the issue is not teaching false doctrine about Jesus. The issue in this letter is male ego. Well, there are a lot of ways that it's like 2 John and a little bit different than 2 John. We'll talk about those when we come to them, and we'll get into the text tomorrow. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes.